The rain over the city did not wash away the grime. It merely suspended it in a low, amber mist that tasted of copper and exhaust. At 25, Maeve Linnea Vance learned that an entire life could be disassembled in less time than it took to drink a cup of black coffee. The eviction from her meticulously organized desk at the city archives had been quiet, efficient, and devastatingly absolute. They had called it a restructuring, a necessary purge following a manufactured scandal involving missing structural blueprints, a delicate lie orchestrated by the very hands she once believed would hold her future. Julian, with his perfectly tailored coats and teeth that caught the light of high society galas, had not even looked at her when he delivered the final severance. He simply laid a rusted iron key and a yellow deed onto the mahogany table, a parting gift from a family that had decided her existence was no longer a profitable venture. Now the city was a jagged silhouette fading in her rearview mirror, its industrial smog thinning into the cold, predatory stillness of the Appalachian foothills. The hum of the interstate died, replaced by the uneven gravel of a mountain pass that seemed to swallow sound entirely. Maeve kept her hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel of her battered sedan, her knuckles white against the worn vinyl. The air changing through the vents was different here, thicker, heavy with the scent of damp slate, decaying pine, and an ancient, unbothered rot. It felt oppressive, this silence. It was the kind of quiet that did not soothe, but rather demanded an accounting of everything a person had lost. She had been erased. The realization did not come with tears. It settled into her ribs like a cold weight. In the span of 48 hours, her apartment lease had been terminated under a morals clause, her bank accounts frozen under the weight of a legal labyrinth her family controlled, and her name scrubbed from the digital directory of the institution she had given her youth to protect. Her mother's parting words had been delivered via an attorney. "You were always too much like your father's mother, Maeve. Go find what she left behind." What Adalia Vance had left behind was a blank space on a map, a piece of land the family had written off as a tax deficit 40 years ago. As the road narrowed into a single, cracked vein of asphalt, bordered by towering oaks that leaned over the car like sentinels, Maeve felt the literal and metaphorical crossroads of her life tightening around her. Behind her lay the ghost of a woman who had curated historical documents for a living, a woman who had trusted a man's promises and a family's bloodline. Ahead lay nothing but the gray, undulating spine of the mountains, shrouded in an early autumn fog that bled the color from the world. The car rattled over a wooden timber bridge, the boards groaning under the weight. Maeve pulled over where the asphalt gave way entirely to a dirt trail choked with overgrown briars. She killed the engine. The sudden absence of the motor's vibration made her ears ring. She looked down at her lap, where the iron key sat. It was heavy, pitting with orange oxidation that stained her fingertips. This key did not belong to a modern deadbolt. It was a relic of an era when security was measured in forged iron and heavy timber. Stepping out of the car, the mountain air hit her lungs like a slap. It was sharp, devoid of the familiar city ozone, carrying the scent of an impending frost. The silence here was loud. It was a heavy, physical presence that pressed against her ears, emphasizing the absolute solitude of her position. There were no sirens, no hum of distant transformers, no chatter of pedestrians on concrete. There was only the wind clicking through dry leaves and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling the canopy. She walked toward the rusted iron gate that marked the boundary of the deed. The gate was choked with wild wisteria vines, their thick, woody ropes twisting through the bars like muscle, locking it shut. It was a physical manifestation of her family's neglect, a barrier meant to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep whatever was inside from bleeding into their manicured reality. Maeve reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal. This was her inheritance. Not the Vance fortune, not the brownstone in the historic district, but a wilderness that had spent 4 decades erasing any sign of human intrusion. A profound sense of displacement washed over her. In the city, she had been defined by her proximity to history, by her ability to catalog and preserve the lives of others. Here, she had no context. She was a stranger in a coat too thin for the altitude, standing at the edge of a forgotten world with nothing but a suitcase in her trunk and a name that had been stripped of its value. The betrayal by Julian wasn't just a broken engagement. It was a calculated eviction from her own identity. He had taken her work, her reputation, and her security, leaving her with a piece of paper that felt less like a deed and more like a sentence. Yet, as she looked through the tangled vines toward the dark silhouette of the ridgeline, a spark of cold, stubborn survival ignited beneath her panic. They had expected her to break. They had given her this worthless patch of earth hoping she would crawl back to the city, begging for a lesser position, a quiet compromise, a graceful surrender. They wanted her compliant, broken, and small. Maeve tightened her grip on the key until the metal bit into her palm, the sharp pain grounding her in the damp mountain air. She would not beg. She looked back at the road she had traveled, the path that led back to the smoky, unfeeling gray of the urban sprawl, and then she turned her back on it. She began to untangle the first vine from the gate, her hands moving with a deliberate, rhythmic intensity. The city had erased her, but the mountain did not know her name yet. As the first thick stalk of wisteria snapped under her pull, releasing a bitter green scent into the fog, Maeve stepped across the threshold. The transition was silent, absolute, and permanent. The dirt track beneath her boots was less a road and more a dried riverbed, choked with jagged limestone and the aggressive roots of encroaching hemlocks. Maeve walked ahead of her car, clearing the largest of the fallen limbs by hand, her breath blooming in brief white plumes against the gathering dusk. When the trees finally parted, Blackwood did not reveal itself so much as it loomed out of the fog, a monolithic specter of a forgotten century. It was an ash-colored Victorian homestead, its timber weathered to the shade of wet slate, standing like a skeletal sentry against the ridge. The wraparound porch had sagged in the center, a slow-motion collapse where the rotting cedar steps met the damp earth. Wild blackberry briars, thick as a man's wrist and armed with curved thorns, climbed the fluted porch pillars, weaving through the cracked glass of the bay windows like barbed wire. This was not the quaint, rustic retreat her romantic imagination might have conjured in the sterile safety of the city archives. This was a feral, suffocating wilderness. To her left, the remains of what must have been Idalia's famed orchard stretched into the mist, a graveyard of dying timber. The apple trees were stunted, their branches twisted into grotesque, arthritic shapes, choked by pale green lichen and strangled by parasitic mistletoe. Half-rotted fruit from seasons past lay melted into the grass, filling the air with a faint, vinegar tang of fermentation. The soil beneath her feet was gray, dusty, and sour, stripped of its vitality by decades of unchecked erosion and the relentless, predatory advance of the mountain scrub. Maeve stopped at the base of the porch, the weight of the silence settling over her shoulders like a leaden cloak. A profound, hollow despair threatened to pull her to her knees. The house was swallowing itself into the earth, a monument to decay that seemed to mock her arrival. Her family had known exactly what they were doing when they handed her this deed. It was an execution carried out with a notary's stamp. They had sent her here to be buried by the wilderness, to starve quietly among the thorns where her ruined reputation could never stain their pristine social standing. Julian's cold smile flashed in her mind, a phantom cruelty that made the damp chill of the evening feel even sharper. She reached out and touched the porch railing. The wood groaned, dropping a soft handful of gray rot onto her boots. For a long, agonizing moment, the urge to turn back, to crawl back to the city and plead for whatever scraps of mercy her family might offer, clawed at her throat. But then she looked down at the earth again. She looked at the cracked, pale dirt, the choked roots, and the scarred landscape that had been abandoned, stripped of its purpose, and left to rot in the shadows of the peaks. A strange, quiet alchemy occurred within her chest. The despair did not vanish, but it hardened, twisting into a grim, survivalist stubbornness that felt colder and truer than anything she had ever experienced. The land was ruined, yes, but so was she. The estate had been cast out by the Vance name, scrubbed from the family history just as she had been expunged from the city ledgers. There was a mirror in this decay. The wilderness was not her enemy. It was her contemporary. In its shattered, unyielding silence, she recognized her own state of being. If this earth was dead, then they would rot together. But if there was a single ember of life left in these deep Appalachian roots, she would drag it into the light. With a deliberate breath that steadied her shaking hands, Maeve climbed the groaning porch steps, avoiding the soft, hollow spots where the timber had entirely given way. She fit the heavy iron key into the front door's massive brass lock. For a terrifying second, the mechanism refused to budge, frozen by 40 years of rust and mountain moisture. She leaned her shoulder against the solid oak door, throwing her weight into the turn, ignoring the sharp sting of a splinter piercing her palm. With a loud metallic crack that echoed through the empty orchard like a gunshot, the deadbolt gave way. The door swung inward on screaming hinges, releasing a wave of trapped air that smelled of old wool, dried lavender, and the deep, mineral dust of a tomb. The interior was swallowed by a thick, velvety darkness, save for the weak, gray evening light that followed her across the threshold. The entrance hall was vast, dominated by a sweeping staircase whose banister was coated in a thick velvet layer of dust. Cobwebs hung in heavy, intricate draperies from the plaster ceiling, swaying gently in the sudden draft she had created. She did not step inside immediately. She stood on the threshold, the cold wind at her back pressing her forward into the gloom. Her expensive city coat was already stained with grease from her car and the gray rot of the porch. Her hands were soiled, her fingernails caked with the ash-colored dirt of Blackwood. She looked back one last time at the mountain pass, where the road out was quickly being erased by the descending night. There was no going back. The woman who had curated the histories of others was dead, left behind in the smog of the city. Maeve stepped inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind her, the click of the latch sounding absolute in the darkness. She was alone in a house that belonged to a ghost, surrounded by an empire of thorns. But as she struck her first match, the small, frail yellow flame illuminating the peeling wallpaper of the foyer, she knew she had passed the point of fear. They wanted her to die out here in the dark, but they had forgotten that seeds, no matter how long they are buried in the dark, are designed to fight their way through the dirt. The transition from autumn's first frost to the deep, biting cold of the mountain winter was marked not by calendar pages, but by the physical taxes levied on Maeve's flesh. The grueling reality of reclaiming Blackwood Orchard began with a rusted iron mattock and a pair of canvas work gloves she found in a kitchen drawer, which wore through within her first 48 hours of labor. For a city-bred woman whose hands had known only the smooth vellum of archival documents and the effortless glide of fountain pens, the work was a violent shock to the system. The wild blackberry briars did not yield easily. They fought back, their curved thorns tearing through her denim sleeves and slicing into her palms. Every morning began the same way. In the freezing dawn, her joints stiff and aching, she would force her swollen fingers to close around the splintered ash handle of her tools. Blisters rose, filled with fluid, popped, and wept against the rough wood, only to harden eventually into thick, yellow calluses that altered the very geometry of her hands. The grief that had weighed heavily on her chest during her first weeks at the estate began to change its state of matter, evaporating under the heat of pure physical exhaustion and solidifying into a quiet, focused fury. With every strike of the mattock into the frozen, gray earth, she was striking back at Julian, at her family, and at the gilded world that had discarded her. She stopped checking the cracked mirror in the foyer. Her skin grew lean, tanned by the harsh winter sun and hardened by the wind. Her shoulders broadening under the weight of the logs she hauled to feed the wood-burning stove that kept the skeletal house alive. By late winter, she had cleared a small, jagged perimeter of breathing room around the homestead, a patch of dark earth won from the wilderness through sheer, stubborn muscle. Her focus turned toward the western slope of the ridge, where the collapsed skeleton of what had once been an extensive Victorian greenhouse lay buried beneath 40 years of invasive kudzu and dead cedar limbs. The glass panes had long since shattered, leaving a treacherous field of green and clear shards that glinted like ice in the dirt. It took her 3 days of meticulous, back-breaking labor just to clear the fallen timber and pull away the thick carpets of dead vines, exposing the original dry stone foundation Idalia had built. It was during the late afternoon of the 4th day, as she was prying a massive, rotten cedar beam from the rear wall of the foundation, that the earth gave way beneath her boot. The iron head of her mattock struck something that did not ring like granite or yield like roots. It was a dull, hollow thud of iron on heavy oak. Maeve dropped to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her calloused fingers clawing at the loose, sour dirt and wet leaves. Beneath the debris lay a horizontal hatch door made of old-growth white oak, bound by thick straps of hand-forged iron that had turned a deep velvet red with rust, but remained structurally unbroken. The lock was a heavy, square mechanism that defied the key she carried, but the wood around the latch had softened with decades of moisture. Maeve jammed the pry bar beneath the iron strap, throwing her entire body weight against the lever, her teeth bared in a silent snarl of exertion. With a splintering scream of ancient wood and a shower of orange rust, the hatch popped open, revealing a dark, vertical shaft that descended into the limestone bedrock beneath the greenhouse foundation. A blast of air rushed out of the opening, not the stagnant, rotten odor of a grave, but a clean, cool, and strangely dry draft that smelled faintly of parched clay, ozone, and dried wintergreen. She returned with a flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that felt like hope for the first time in months. Dropping down into the dark, her boots found the solid rungs of a stone ladder built directly into the foundation wall. At the bottom lay a subterranean chamber, roughly 10 by 12 feet, carved out of the cool limestone. The engineering was precise. Idalia had constructed a passive ventilation system using ceramic pipes that drew in dry air while keeping out the dampness of the mountain subsoil. As Maeve shone the beam of her flashlight around the room, the shadows danced across rows of meticulous wooden shelving that lined the stone walls from floor to ceiling. Resting on those shelves were hundreds of hand-blown glass jars, each one sealed with thick green wax and cork. Inside the glass, safe from the damp, the rodents, and the passage of 4 decades, lay a treasure trove of life. Thousands of tiny, teardrop-shaped seeds that caught the artificial light like polished garnets. They were the seeds of the blackwood amaranth, a deep crimson grain that her grandmother had spent a lifetime perfecting before her history was erased by her descendants. In the center of the room sat a heavy zinc-topped table, untouched by time. Atop the metal surface lay 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers and a series of rolled vellum blueprints. Maeve approached the table with a reverence she hadn't felt since her days in the great archives of the city. She blew a fine layer of white dust from the topmost ledger and opened it. The pages were made of heavy rag paper, covered in a beautiful, spidery script, written in faded iron gall ink. As a trained archivist, Maeve recognized immediately that this was not a standard botanical journal. The text was written in a meticulous, poetic cipher, a complex system of metaphors, astronomical charts, and lyrical verses that disguised advanced agricultural formulas and soil chemistry equations. Idalia had written her life's work in a language only someone trained in the preservation of secrets could decode. The blueprints laid out detailed schematics for a revolutionary method of soil restoration, illustrating how the deep taproots of this specific amaranth could draw up minerals from the limestone bedrock, breaking down the sour, depleted topsoil and renewing its fertility without the need for modern chemicals. Maeve traced her fingers over the crimson ink diagrams of the plant's anatomy. The family had called Idalia mad, using her eccentricities as an excuse to lock her away and abandon her land when they couldn't turn a quick profit from her research. But looking at this subterranean sanctuary, Maeve saw the truth clear as glass. Her grandmother was a genius who had foreseen the collapse of the valley's ecosystem long before corporate agriculture stripped the soil bare. Idalia had hidden her legacy here, beneath the dirt, waiting for someone with the patience to dig for it. Someone who knew how to read the silent stories left behind in the dark. The realization washed over her with the force of an incoming tide. She was no longer just a castaway surviving on a ruined estate. She was the custodian of a revolution. Her family had stripped her of her name and her career, but through a twist of poetic justice they could never have anticipated, they had delivered her directly to the source of her true power. Maeve closed the ledger, the heavy thud of the paper sounding like a vow in the quiet of the cellar. She looked at the jars of crimson seeds gleaming on the shelves, then down at her own scarred, calloused hands. The city had broken her life into pieces, but here, in the cold subsoil of Blackwood, she had found the blueprint to build something unbreakable. The cipher took 3 weeks to crack. 3 weeks of cold nights spent huddled by the wood stove with a kerosene lamp and a modern lexicon of botany she had managed to order using the last remaining funds in her emergency cash reserve. Idalia's poetic code was elegant, relying on the Old English names of flora and medieval alchemical symbols to mask highly advanced principles of genetic resilience and nitrogen fixation. As the winter frost began to yield to the wet, heavy mud of an Appalachian spring, Maeve realized her grandmother had achieved something miraculous. She had not merely collected seeds. She had engineered a biological savior for a valley dying of industrial exhaustion. The first person to see her outside the perimeter of the overgrown orchards was Caleb Thorne. He arrived on a battered flatbed truck that smelled of charcoal, sulfur, and wet iron, hauling a load of reclaimed timber for a fence line down the road. He was a tall man, built like the hemlocks that grew out of the limestone cliffs, his forearms mapped with old burns from his forge, and his eyes the color of cold river water. He did not speak at first. He simply stood by the rusted iron gate she had unchained weeks prior, watching her haul a heavy sack of river sand up the steep incline of the driveway. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly baritone that belonged to the soil itself, devoid of the hurried cadence of the city. He asked if she was the one who had been clearing the old greenhouse foundation, and when she gave him a sharp, defensive nod, his gaze shifted to her scarred hands. He told her his grandfather had been the blacksmith who forged the iron straps for Idalia's cellars. He was the only person left in the valley who remembered that the old woman wasn't the mad recluse the Vance family had painted her to be. Caleb walked the ruined rows of the orchard with her that afternoon, pointing out what the corporate surveyors had missed 40 years ago. He explained how the commercial coal mines and intensive timber logging up the ridge had poisoned the water table, leaving the topsoil sour, acidic, and thin as paper. The Vance family, eager to cash in on the agricultural booms of the previous generation, had demanded Idalia use synthetic fertilizers to force a high-yield timber crop. When she refused, choosing instead to focus her research on a native grain that could heal the earth naturally, they cut her funding, declared her legally incompetent, and left the valley with whatever liquid assets they could strip from the estate. They wanted immediate wealth. Idalia was playing a game that required generations to understand. Caleb knew the valley's temperament, its microclimates, and the precise rhythm of the mountain springs. But he lacked the scientific blueprint to fix the dying land his own family had farmed for a century. Maeve had the records, the exact soil chemistry ratios, and the dormant genetic treasure hidden in the limestone vault. But she lacked the physical machinery and the local trust required to cultivate it on a scale that mattered. Standing in the skeletal remains of the orchard, surrounded by the gray, unyielding earth, they forged a silent, pragmatic pact. Caleb would provide the heavy equipment, the draft horses, and the local labor needed to turn the compacted soil. Maeve would direct the restoration using Idalia's decoded notebooks, acting as the architect of the resurrection. The work began in earnest, during the first true week of April, when the mud had dried just enough to allow a plow to slice through the sod. The process was delicate, an experimental dance between historical theory and brutal physical labor. The Blackwood amaranth was a peculiar creature. According to Idalia's notes, it could not be planted in standard, nutrient-rich commercial fertilizer. It required an environment of adversity to trigger its survival mechanisms. Idalia had written that the seed needed to be laid in a bed of wood ash and crushed limestone, a chemical environment that would mimic the aftermath of a forest fire. Together, Maeve and Caleb transformed the cleared greenhouse plot into a testing ground. Caleb constructed a massive, wood-fired kiln down by the creek, burning sweet gum and hickory timber to produce a fine, white ash rich in potash. Maeve spent her mornings in the subterranean cellar, carefully unsealing the green wax from the first dozen glass jars, her heart racing as she poured the tiny, garnet-colored spheres into linen sacks. The seeds were dry, almost weightless, yet they carried the weight of 40 years of buried vindication. They mixed the seeds by hand with the wood ash and the pulverized limestone Caleb had ground at his forge, creating a gray, powdery matrix that looked more like concrete mix than agricultural soil. Under the skeptical gaze of the few crows that circled the mountain peaks, they sowed the first half-acre by hand, walking in a rhythmic, ancient cadence across the gray slope, flinging the seed into the fresh furrows Caleb's horses had carved into the earth. The first fortnight was a period of agonizing silence. The weather turned unseasonably cold, a late spring snap that coated the valley in a thin layer of crystalline frost. Maeve slept fitfully in the drafty Victorian house, waking every few hours to check the temperature, convinced that the frost had killed her grandmother's dream before it could even breach the surface. She spent her days walking the rows, kneeling in the dirt, her fingers gently parting the gray ash mix to look for any sign of cellular activity. The doubt was a physical ache, a whispering echo of Julian's voice telling her she was out of her depth, that she belonged in the dust of the archives rather than the living chaos of the world. But Idalia's science was not flawed. It was merely patient. On the 16th morning, after a night of warm, sulphurous rain that rolled off the coal ridges, Maeve found the first breakthrough. It was not a green shoot. True to its nature, the blackwood amaranth did not emerge with the standard emerald hue of common weeds. It pierced the gray crust of the ash like small, jagged shards of broken glass, a brilliant, deep crimson sprout so dark it looked almost black against the pale soil. She stayed on her knees for a long time, the damp earth soaking through her trousers, her eyes locked on that tiny speck of defiant color. Caleb found her there when he came up the trail with a team of horses, his quiet expression breaking into a rare, slow smile as he looked down at the row. The seed had remembered its purpose. It had survived the dark, the neglect, and the family that had tried to starve it into oblivion. As Maeve stood up, wiping the red mud from her palms onto her apron, she looked up at the barren ridges surrounding the estate. The forgotten science had been unlocked, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackwood, she felt the true shift in the wind. They had planted more than a crop. They had sown the first row of an empire that would soon turn the entire Grey Valley into a flood of blood-red defiance. By the arrival of the midsummer heat, the half-acre testing ground had exploded into an aggressive, towering canopy of deep burgundy. The Blackwood amaranth did not grow with the polite, structured uniformity of commercial corn or wheat. It surged out of the earth like a wild, primitive force, its thick, fibrous stalks reaching over 6 feet in height, each plant crowned in a massive, heavy plume of velvety crimson blossoms that resembled frozen plumes of smoke. True to Idalia's encoded calculations, the crop's massive taproots acted as biological drills, fracturing the compacted clay and drawing up deep-lying calcium and mineral deposits to neutralize the acidic topsoil. Where the earth had been a pale, lifeless gray for 40 years, it was now turning a rich, moist chocolate brown beneath the shade of the crimson leaves. As the weeks bled into August, the crimson tide spilled over the boundaries of the greenhouse plot. With Caleb's local connections and Maeve's precise historical blueprints for crop rotation, they cleared the dead timber from the western terraces, replacing the skeletal orchard with acre after acre of the resilient grain. The landscape underwent a breathtaking, almost surreal transformation. When the mountain winds swept down from the ridges, the hillsides did not look like farmland. They looked like a vast, undulating sea of deep scarlet, a living tapestry of blood-red velvet that shimmered under the Appalachian sun. Travelers on the state highway down in the valley began to pull their trucks over to the shoulder, staring up at the ridges in silent awe at the sudden, impossible color bleeding across the mountain. But the true miracle of Blackwood was not merely visual, it was economic. The corporate coal closures and the failure of chemical-dependent tobacco farms had left the local community hollowed out, leaving generations of families stranded in a cycle of poverty and systemic neglect. Maeve realized very quickly that she could not harvest an empire alone. Using Idalia's detailed journals on agrarian collectivism, she bypassed the traditional corporate distribution models that had once enriched her family. She established the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative, inviting the local families, those who had been ruined by the very forces that discarded her, to lease portions of the restored land in exchange for a share of the collective yield. She was no longer the fragile, abandoned girl who had arrived in the valley with nothing but a rusted key and a broken heart. Her physical transformation was now complete. Her skin was bronze. Her voice carried the quiet, unassailable authority of someone who had wrung life out of stone, and her mind was sharper than it had ever been in the sterile halls of the city archives. She managed the cooperative with the meticulous precision of an archivist and the fierce protective instinct of a matriarch. She organized the local workforce, converting Caleb's old ironworks into a processing mill, where the heavy amaranth heads were threshed, releasing millions of the high-protein, gluten-free garnet seeds that were rapidly becoming highly sought after by organic distributors in the eastern markets. Maeve established a sustainable, closed-loop microeconomy within the valley. The stalks of the amaranth, rich in cellulose, were processed into high-grade organic livestock fodder for the local dairy farmers, while the oil extracted from the seeds was channeled into small-scale cosmetic and pharmaceutical collectives Caleb helped organize. Families who had lived on government assistance for a decade were suddenly earning a sovereign living, their hands stained with the same crimson dust that had become Maeve's badge of honor. The local diner, the hardware store, and the small gravel mill down the road began to thrum with a forgotten vitality. Blackwood had become the heart of the region, pumping life and capital back into a community that the world had written off as dead. Every evening, Maeve stood on the wraparound porch of the Victorian house, which Caleb had helped structurally stabilize with heavy oak beams. Looking out over the valley, she watched the lights of the farmhouse kitchens flicker on, one by one, nestled within the vast, dark red sea of the crops. The oppressive silence that had terrified her upon her arrival had been replaced by a productive, rhythmic hum, the distant murmur of the processing mill, the laughter of children playing in the cleared lanes, and the steady, reassuring rustle of millions of amaranth leaves breathing in the night air. She had not just survived the exile her family had imposed upon her, she had rewritten the rules of the terrain. She had built a new paradigm from the dirt up, proving that the ultimate revenge was not to strike back at those who had erased her, but to grow an entirely new world where their names no longer carried any currency. The autumn harvest was at its zenith when the vultures finally circled back. It began with the arrival of 3 black, pristine luxury SUVs that cut through the dust of the mountain pass like a funeral procession, their polished chrome grills completely out of place against the raw, visceral scarlet of the amaranth fields. They parked in a neat, predatory line at the foot of the driveway, their engines humming with expensive, mechanical arrogance. From the middle vehicle stepped her mother, Victoria Vance, draped in a cashmere coat that belonged in a country club, followed closely by Julian. His hair was still perfectly shellacked, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, and his mouth set in that familiar, condescending line she had once mistaken for confidence. Behind them came a phalanx of corporate attorneys carrying leather briefcases, their polished Oxfords sinking instantly into the rich, red-stained mud of the cooperative lane. They had caught wind of the Appalachian miracle. The agricultural journals had been running front-page profiles on the dramatic ecological reclamation of the valley, and the market projections for the Blackwood Amaranth Cooperative were already valued in the millions. The family that had thrown Maeve out like garbage had returned to claim the treasure she had dug out of the stone. Maeve did not walk down to meet them. She stood her ground at the edge of the western terrace, her denim shirt sleeves rolled to her elbows, her boots caked in dirt, and an old iron sickle resting casually across her shoulder. Caleb stood 10 paces behind her, silent as an anvil, his arms crossed over his chest, while a dozen local farmers stopped their threshing to watch the intrusion from the rows. The tension in the air was thick, sharp, and smelling faintly of ozone, like the minutes before a summer lightning strike. Julian was the first to speak as they reached the terrace, his voice carrying that smooth, urban cadence that now sounded incredibly hollow to her ears. He smiled, a practiced, transactional gesture, and told her she had done a remarkable job cleaning up the place, but that the play acting was over. Victoria stepped forward next, her eyes scanning the sea of deep crimson with an insatiable, calculating greed. She did not ask how Maeve had survived the winter. Instead, she signaled her lead attorney, who stepped forward and produced a sleek white document, a formal rescission of the deed, citing a clause that claimed the land was corporate property of the Vance estate and had been transferred to Maeve under legal duress and fraudulent misrepresentation during the archival audit. They had come to strip her bare a second time, confident that a lonely 25-year-old exile would collapse under the weight of their legal machinery. Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice to that intimate, manipulative purr he had used to betray her. He told her that if she cooperated, if she handed over the seed stock and the cultivation formulas quietly, he would personally ensure her name was restored to the city registries and that she would be taken care of. He treated her like the broken girl he had left behind in the rain. Maeve let out a low, dry laugh that cut through the mountain wind like a blade. She didn't flinch. She didn't rage. Her training as an archivist had taught her one fundamental truth. People lie, but paper always remembers. She reached into the canvas satchel slung across her hip and pulled out not a legal brief, but Idalia's original leather-bound ledger, the one written in the poetic cipher they had assumed was the rambling of a lunatic. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, Maeve turned the heavy rag pages until she reached the final appendix, which had been sealed with an intricate, hidden wax-overlapping layer she had discovered only months ago. She looked directly into her mother's cold eyes and began to read aloud, her voice resonant, clear, and utterly unyielding. Idalia Vance had been many things, but she was not foolish. Anticipating the greed of her own children, she had executed a secret, ironclad codicil to the original land patent, filed directly with the Federal Land Registry 60 years prior, and hidden within the botanical descriptions of the amaranth root architecture. The legal addendum explicitly stated that the title to Blackwood could never be reassigned, sold, or reclaimed by the corporate entity of the Vance family if the land fell into environmental decay. Furthermore, the codicil stipulated that the deed would automatically vest irrevocably and permanently in the sole possession of whichever blood descendant actually lived on the soil, worked it by hand, and, in Idalia's exact poetic phrasing, breathed life back into the dirt. The lead attorney's face drained of color as Maeve held up a certified copy of the federal land patent verification, which she had quietly obtained through her archival connections 3 weeks ago. She had filed the activation of the codicil the moment the first acre of amaranth went to seed. The law was absolute, historical, and entirely on her side. The Vance family did not own Blackwood. They hadn't owned it since the moment they abandoned it 40 years ago. By throwing Maeve out and handing her the deed to rid themselves of a tax liability, they had legally signed away the very empire they were now trying to steal. Julian's composure fractured first. His aristocratic mask slipped, his face twisting into an ugly, desperate sneer as he stepped forward, reaching out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could even brush her sleeve, Caleb stepped into the light, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the younger man. Julian froze, his eyes darting from Caleb's scarred fists to the dozen local farmers who had silently moved in from the crimson rows, their iron tools gleaming in the autumn sun. The mountain was no longer an empty wilderness. It was a fortress, and Maeve was its commander. Maeve looked at Julian, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a titan of high society, but as a small, parasitic creature who could only build things by stealing the labor of others. She told him that he had come all this way just to realize he was completely irrelevant. She looked at her mother, whose mouth was working in a silent, furious rhythm, unable to comprehend that the daughter she had discarded had grown into something she could neither buy nor break. Maeve raised her hand, pointing the tip of her iron sickle toward the luxury vehicles parked below. She told them to leave her land before the sun dipped below the ridge, and she promised them that if a single corporate suit ever crossed the Wisteria Gate again, she would use her archival training to unearth and publish every financial irregularity, every hidden liability, and every manufactured scandal her family had buried in the city ledgers over the last 30 years. She had spent her youth cataloging their secrets. She knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The defeat was total, quiet, and humiliatingly public. Victoria turned on her heel without a word, her heels clicking uselessly against the stones as she retreated toward the SUVs. Julian followed her, his shoulders slumped, his golden boy posture shattered by a woman he thought he had destroyed. As the engines roared to life and the black vehicles sped down the mountain trail, throwing up a cloud of pale, dusty ash that was quickly swallowed by the red fields, Maeve let out a long, clean breath. The past had come to collect its debt, but it had found her accounts fully paid, her roots running too deep for their wind to shake. The dust raised by the retreating luxury vehicles took a long time to settle, hanging like a pale, ghostly curtain over the road before the mountain wind finally tore it apart and scattered it into the dense forest. In the absolute quiet that followed, the rhythmic thrum of the cooperative mill resumed, its steady, mechanical heartbeat anchoring the valley once more. The legal victory was absolute. Within a week, the Federal Land Registry confirmed the permanent, unassailable status of the Blackwood Agricultural Sanctuary, an ironclad designation that protected the acreage from corporate acquisition, logging, or mining for the next 2 centuries. The predators had retreated into the sprawling concrete labyrinth of the city, utterly defeated by the very archival precision and ancient legal frameworks they had once used to strip Maeve of her dignity. As October deepened, the true autumn of the high country set in, painting the ridges in brilliant shocks of amber, copper, and gold that framed the deep, unchanging crimson of the amaranth terraces. The air became so crisp it felt like breathing glass, carrying the rich, toasted scent of the cooperative's drying kilns. The old Victorian homestead had been fully transformed. Its sagged porch was now straight and proud, supported by heavy, hand-hewn oak timber that Caleb had notched and raised by hand. The weathered, ash-colored wood of the exterior had been scrubbed clean and treated with local linseed oils, making the house look less like a ruin swallowing itself into the earth and more like an organic extension of the limestone cliff behind it. Maeve stood on the wraparound porch as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged spine of the mountains, casting long, violet shadows across the valley. She was 26 now, the milestones of her previous life, the gilded galas, the sterile archival desks, the fragile promises made by a man who measured worth in stock options, felt like the folklore of a stranger. She looked down at her right hand, where a faint, thin scar ran across her palm, a permanent reminder of the splinter she had taken the night she forced open the heavy oak door. Her hands were no longer the pale, delicate instruments of a city clerk. They were the hands of an architect, tough, calloused, and deeply stained around the cuticles with the indelible garnet pigment of the crop she had raised from the dead. She was no longer defined by the abandonment that had brought her to this ridge. The people who had left her in the rain had intended her exile to be a slow erasure, a quiet fading away in an unmapped wilderness. Instead, they had unwittingly handed her the keys to an ancient, sleeping kingdom. She had taken the shattered fragments of her grandmother's memory, decoded her brilliant, lonely genius, and turned a tax deficit into a sovereign empire that now fed and sustained an entire region. The local families who had once looked at the mountain with despair were now loading trucks with sacks of grain stamped with the Blackwood seal, their futures secured by a sustainable, defiant economy that answered to no corporate board. Caleb walked up the porch steps carrying a heavy iron lantern that cast a warm, flickering amber glow across the new cedar boards. He did not say anything as he took his place beside her, leaning his forearms against the solid railing and looking out over the red terraces. They had developed a quiet, telepathic language over the months of shared labor, a mutual understanding born of dirt, iron, and survival. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, dry amaranth head that had been plucked from the very first row they sowed in the ash. Maeve took the dried flower, crushing it gently between her fingers. Millions of tiny, polished garnet seeds spilled into her palm, catching the last, fiery light of the setting sun like a handful of fresh embers. The Blackwood amaranth was going to seed now, its heavy, velvet plumes bowing low toward the earth, preparing to drop its lineage into the dark soil before the first true blizzard locked the mountain pass. The crop had done its work. It had broken the sour clay, cleaned the water, and healed the scarred hillsides. It was ready for the coming winter. A lone hawk circled high above the canopy, its sharp cry echoing through the valley, before it disappeared into the dark pines of the ridge. Maeve opened her hand, letting the mountain wind catch the seeds in her palm, watching them scatter across the porch and into the garden beds below. She felt an immense, grounded peace settle into her bones, a stillness that had nothing to do with the absence of sound and everything to do with the presence of purpose. The city had tried to bury her, but they had forgotten that she came from a line of women who knew how to turn ash into bread and wilderness into a fortress. Let the winter come, she thought, looking out over her scarlet empire as the first cold star pierced the violet dusk. The roots were deep, the sanctuary was secure, and the legacy was unbreakable.